Hello again and welcome to another Warlord Wednesday, the episode of the week where we talk about all things bolt action. In today's episode, we are going to be doing another unit review, this time taking a look at one of the Germans' most common main battle tanks of the entire war. It is, of course, the Panzer IV. In case you've not seen one of these unit reviews before, here is what you can expect. I will start off with a unit overview, taking a look at the weapons, war gear, ability, and points of each unit. Then we move on to the deep dive, where we lift up the rock and have a look at the nitty-gritty detail underneath. Finally, we close out the episode with a score out of 10 and some final thoughts. And so, without further ado, let's Achtung Panzer! And dive right into today's episode. Now, the first thing to mention about the Panzer IV, like with so many other German tanks in bolt action, is there's quite a lot of different vehicles that come under the umbrella of the Panzer IV. In fact, there are 3 different variants that you can take, and we're going to cover all of them in today's video. Despite all of the differences between the different variants, they do share a number of common principles. Firstly, every Panzer IV is an armoured vehicle. This means that by and large, they're immune to small arms fire. If you don't have a penetration value on your weapon, you're unlikely to be able to threaten the Panzer. Secondly, as is common with many but not all vehicles in bolt action, the Panzer IV is a single model unit. Unlike an infantry squad, which comes with between 5 and 10 people typically in its unit, Panzer IV is a single model. And finally, all Panzer IVs can generally be considered to be a take-all-comers unit. Now, there are some differences in the weapons that each model can take, but these kind of factor into the time period and the kind of enemies you're likely to engage. And so, generally speaking, a Panzer IV can be sent in against most targets in the game and have a reasonable chance of damaging or destroying them. If you come up against enemy infantry, Panzer IV can handle it. If you come up against enemy light and medium armor, the Panzer IV is in its element. And even enemy heavy armor can be threatened by some of the later war variants of the Panzer IV. Overall, the tank could be described as a jack of all trades and master of none. And it's this quality which makes it so popular with bolt action Axis players. Being able to take a Panzer IV, just chuck it into your list and cover so many bases at once is fantastic. And it just means that any situation you encounter on the battlefield, you've got a tool for the job. It may not always be the best tool. Sometimes you may wish you had a more specialized vehicle. But you also know that whatever happens, your Panzer IV has got your back. Let's get down to brass tacks. The Panzer IVA is more of an outlier to the overall Panzer IV family. It's very much an early war unit, and generally speaking, you're going to find it limited to those themed or more narrative games where you're playing in a specific time period. In fact, you're more likely to come across the second kind of Panzer IV you can take, which is the Panzer IV B, C, D, E, and F. Now, in bolt action, all of these different variants are categorized under one single entry because essentially the differences between models were relatively minor and don't really impact the unit's performance on the tabletop game. Going forward, I'm just going to refer to this as the Panzer IV-B just for simplicity. Now, the B is definitely a tank that you are likely to encounter on the tabletop. It's still not the most common variant of the Panzer IV, but it's not one that you can entirely discount. This vehicle essentially has the same loadout as the A. It's got that light howitzer, coaxial MMG, and a forward-facing MMG. Except you can take this as either inexperienced, regular, or veteran for 140, 175, and 210 points respectively. The main difference between the A and the B is that the Panzer B is armor 9+. This makes it a solid medium tank and gives it a significant boost in durability. The Panzer IV-B is much more common than the A because so many more of them were produced, over 1,000 according to the Bolt Action book, and it was active between 1940 and 1943. So more produced, active for more years. This does mean that the tank is technically limited to being used in a mid-war situation. But in most pickup games, people aren't going to worry about that too much. And you can comfortably use your Panzer IV-B or the later model that we're going to have a look at in a moment, relatively interchangeably in your go-to friendly beer and pretzel games of Bolt Action. But the most common Panzer IV that you are likely to encounter on the tabletop, or the one that you are most likely going to use in your own German army, is the late war Panzers, the G, H, and J. Once again, I'm going to just refer to these all as the Panzer IV-G, just to keep things a bit simplified. In Bolt Action terms, that again all lumped under one unit entry, because for tabletop impact, the differences between the G, H, and the J don't matter. This tank had its principal service between 1943 and 1945, which is a late war tank, which is typically the time period that most pickup games take place in. Historically, this tank was the most common Panzer IV, with over 7,300 produced, way more than the other two variants combined. And interestingly, this gets reflected on the tabletop, with the Panzer IV-G being by far the variant of the Panzer that you are most likely to encounter in your pickup games. There are a number of reasons for this on the tabletop and in real life. For example, the Panzer IV comes in all sorts of German star sets, and typically it's the plastic one, and it's got the late war variants, it's got all the sidearm, and it's got the long barrel, and so most people, when they're building their Panzer IV, they just go for what looks cool, most newer players of course, and they go with the one with the biggest barrel and the extra sidearm and all that kind of good stuff. But there's a very good in-game reason why so many German players field this thing, which is what it comes armed with. It comes with the normal coaxial MMG and forward-facing hull MMG that we're familiar with on the other Panzer IV variants. But the big difference here is that it's rocking a turret-mounted heavy anti-tank gun. It is a medium tank with a heavy anti-tank gun, which is actually relatively uncommon in Bolt Action. You'll tend to find that most factions have a light tank with a light anti-tank gun, a medium tank with a medium anti-tank gun, but the Panzer IV is a medium tank with a big old gun, and this allows it to engage so many different targets. You've got infantry bothering you? Well, the high explosive value of the heavy anti-tank gun is actually pretty impressive. Could easily catch a few people in that 2-inch template. Or maybe you're encountering enemy medium armor. Well, you've actually got the advantage over them, both in range and also in penetrative power. And then you come across a heavy tank. Well, not ideal sending a medium against a heavy, but at least you've got a tool that can actually crack open that enemy behemoth. On top of this, there are two other reasons why this tank is so beloved by the German community. The first one's more of a rule of cool. This is the variant that could take the Schützen, or the side skirts. That's the bits of metal that hang over the side of the tank, covering the tracks and also the turret. Honestly, most people build their tanks with these things and they don't realize it's actually a 10-point paid upgrade, and they're just building it because it makes the tank look more armored and cool and tanky. It's pretty aesthetically pleasing. But in game, they're not that a big a deal. They basically make you immune to the shaped charge rule. You can still be penetrated by weapons with the shaped charge rule. They just don't get the bonuses for being a shaped charge. But honestly, the main reason why people love this thing is it is the cheapest way to get Tiger Fear in your force. Even though it's only a Panzer IV, even though it's only a medium tank, it still benefits from Tiger Fear. And Tiger Fear is one of those rules that often pops up for your opponent at the worst possible time. If you don't know what it does, essentially, when you are within 18 inches of a unit with Tiger Fear, unless you give your unit the fire order to shoot at the Tiger Fear unit, so for example, in this case, the Panzer IV, they always count as having one pin on them, even if they don't have any. So if you're within 18 inches of a Panzer IV and you don't have any pins, but you really need to get that run order off so that you can dive onto the objective last turn and win the game, well, you still have to take an order test, and it's still at -1. Tiger Fear can be worked around, and it only affects you within a certain distance, but it's still one of those rules that a lot of people forget about and don't really take into account until suddenly it costs them the game because they failed that vital order check. But all of these perks do come at the cost of an increased points value. For example, at inexperienced, this thing is going to cost you 188 points, regular 235, and veteran an eye-watering 282 points. But that covers our unit overview. We've looked at all the different models of Panzer IV and the differences between them. But now let's move on to the deep dive, the good, the bad, and the ugly of this vehicle and how you can get the most out of it on the battlefield. The first thing I want to say straight out of the gate is the Panzer IV is a fantastic beginner tank. It's actually the variant that most players start with or first encounter because, as I said earlier, it's so common in many of the German starter sets. And for good reason. It's a brilliant way to get new players into the feel of the German faction. Because bolt action is primarily, I would describe as Hollywood World War II. It's less historically accurate. It definitely toes that line between realism and sort of beer and pretzel and arcadey fun. And we all know, according to the films, that the German tanks are the best and they were famous for their tank divisions. Of course, if you know a bit about history, it's not quite as simple as that. But when you're playing a game for fun, you want to get that feel from your faction. You want to feel like you're playing Hollywood Germans a lot of the time. And so this is what the Panzer IV allows you to do. It gives German players easy access to a nice solid bit of medium armor. But on top of that, when you're playing against your friend who's also maybe getting to bolt action the first time, or someone who you play against regularly, your armor, your tanks are always going to feel a bit better than his. Because your Panzer IV comes with a heavy anti-tank gun, and your typical Sherman or Cromwell is only going to come with a medium. Ooh, that makes your German tank feel very good. And then your German tank comes with 2 MMGs, and even if their tank also comes with 2, yours benefit from the Hitler's buzzsaw rule, which means you get an extra shot. So often the German tanks do feel better than their allied counterparts, but you're absolutely paying for that in terms of that inflated points cost. Now, not only does the bigger gun of the Panzer IV make it feel like a German tank, but it also has a really important implication on the tabletop. You are going to outrange your opponent. Now, a medium anti-tank gun still has a fantastic range, 60-inch range, but the heavy anti-tank gun comes with 72. Now, you might be thinking on a typical bolt action board, that's not going to make a huge difference. If I'm within 60, I'm going to be within 72. Like, what's the big difference? It doesn't come down to the maximum range, it comes down to the half range. And this is the biggest advantage of the Panzer IV. It's what makes it so good. When you get good at using this Panzer IV, you will be the scourge of tank duels in your local meta. Because your half range is 36 inches and your opponent's half range is 30. Which means that you can nudge yourself into half range and suddenly you're not suffering the -1 to hit penalty from shooting at long range, but the allied tank is. And if both vehicles are in a nice little bit of light cover that neither one really wants to move, it puts your opponent in a really hard position. Because do they accept the fact that they are going to be not hitting as well as you? They're going to be suffering, let's say, at least a -2 to hit penalty between some light cover and some long range, whereas you're now really suffering a -1 to hit penalty against them, just their light cover. So do they move out to try and get the better shot off? But if they move, unless they're an American tank with gyro stabilizer, which it may happen, but not likely, if they move, then they're still going to be at -2, which means you still have the chance to get the good shot on them before they get a chance to fire back at you. So using this extra range is vitally important to getting the most out of your Panzer IV. And once you master that art of the tank duel, honestly, you are going to really start to feel, even more so than the extra penetrative power, you are really going to start feeling how good the Panzer IV can be. But even if you don't encounter enemy armor and instead you end up using your Panzer against infantry, it's got plenty of tools in the toolbox to scythe down hordes of enemy foot sloggers. Firstly, that heavy anti-tank gun has a 2-inch HE value. So if you have a bunch of enemy infantry that are just running out across an open field or who are really clumped up behind a piece of terrain, just lob that big heavy anti-tank gun into them and get as many as you can under that 2-inch template. Remember, 2-inch template is the same size as a medium mortar, and they are widely considered to be some of the best anti-infantry in the game. Don't forget, of course, that the 2-inch template also gives you a penetration of +2. So when you're fighting against veteran infantry, instead of having to fish for 5s on the machine guns, you can instead use the big gun. Of course, the weakness of the big gun is that it fires one shot, which means if the enemy goes down or they're in some particularly hard cover or you're at range, firing one shot might mean you're not going to get that hit. This is where instead you would switch over to the machine guns. Now, the machine guns, because you've got 2 of them and because of Hitler's buzzsaw, you're actually putting out 12 MMG shots from one Panzer IV. If you're facing off against regular infantry or you're facing off against inexperienced infantry, you will be scything them down by the handful. And even if you're facing off against veteran infantry or other infantry that are really dug into cover, it's still probably worth just hosing them down with the machine guns, try and pick off 1 or 2 of them, but more importantly, get those vital pins on enemy squads. Now, of course, everything that we've looked at so far, all of these tactics have been focused on the late war Panzer IV-G. But you may want to take the Panzer IV-B for a number of reasons. Maybe you're playing a certain time period, maybe you're just trying something out. Maybe in your local meta, you have a real difficulty with loads of infantry being dug into hard cover. In that scenario, you'll probably want the B over the late war version. But understand, by taking the B, your tactics are going to change fundamentally. Firstly, the idea of engaging in tank duels with an early war Panzer is just out of the question. You only have a penetration value of 2 on that light howitzer. Anything that is medium armor or above is basically, you can't damage it. And even if you're trying to pin them up with the HE value on a 4+, they're just going to ignore the pins. And if they're a veteran crew, they're just going to completely ignore any pins that you put them on. In fact, the only reason to take the Panzer IV-B over the late war model is for its ability to deal with entrenched infantry. Perhaps your opponent commonly features weapon teams dug into some hard cover on objectives and you're just really struggling to dig them out. And you've tried assaulting them out with infantry, but it just never quite works for you. This is when you bring in a more specialized unit like the Panzer IV-B. Now, bear in mind, it has no anti-tank, as mentioned, and the size of its anti-infantry weapon, the howitzer, is the same size as the late war one. It's both a 2-inch template. So why would you take it? Well, it can do indirect fire, just like a mortar. So regardless of modifiers, your opponent could be -100 to hit somehow. They've stacked that much cover on it. It's not really possible, but you get the point. If you had a late war Panzer, you're forced to do a direct shot, which means you're forced to just miss. Or you just spend the whole game just firing machine guns at them, fishing for a pin here and there. Not a great use of a 235-point tank. But the Panzer IV-B can go, okay, I see all of your modifiers, and now I'm going to do a drop shot with my howitzer. This means that regardless of the modifiers on you, I'm going to hit you on a 6 this turn. Now, if you don't move, just like with the mortar, next turn, I'm going to hit you on a 5. I'm going to start dialing that shot in, and then a 4, and 3 until eventually you are going to get that hit. And it doesn't matter how well dug in the enemy is. The moment you get that hit, you're ranged in. Suddenly, you're not hitting on 2s with your Panzer IV. Another advantage of the mid-war Panzer is it allows you to play the dice game, how many dice you're putting into the bag. By taking the late war Panzer, sure, you're covering more bases and you're getting more things in one place, but you're also spending more points. So you have less points for other units. If you go for the mid-war, Panzer B, then suddenly you're saving about 60 points. That is a significant discount. And straight away, you can just put those points into another unit. You could take yourself a flamethrower team for that, or a medium mortar, or light howitzer, or light anti-tank. Point is, you can use the points to cover your lack of anti-tank if you want, or to get more HE into your force. This means that you will have 2 units, that's 2 dice that go in the bag, in comparison to the late war Panzer's single dice. Also, you have that fact that if you've got less eggs in one basket, if you lose your mid-war Panzer, okay, sure, you've lost your tank, but you've only lost 1 dice out of the bag, and the points that you saved to get the extra one, well, that one's still in the bag. And it means if you took something, let's say like a Panzer Shrek team with the spare points, it's like, okay, so I may have lost my tank and my anti-infantry, but I've still retained my anti-tank. Whereas when you lose that big, pricey late war Panzer, not only are you losing your tank, but you're probably losing a significant amount of your anti-infantry support fire and also your anti-tank support fire. Yes, there is an advantage to having one unit that can cover everything, but there's also a big hole that is left when that unit gets knocked out. But speaking of problems, no unit is infallible, and the Panzer IV does have a few issues. The first one, as we've mentioned a little bit on and off this video, so I won't overlabor the point, is it is a little pricey in comparison to allied units and even to other units in your German army book. This thing is definitely going to carve out a significant chunk of your points, especially if you're just looking at a 1,000 point or 1,250 point game. Combine this with the fact that a lot of German infantry is going to be taking upgrades such as STGs and Panzerfaust, and if you're not careful, the Panzer IV and your German army overall is going to start feeling very small and very elite. This can be an advantage. It can also be a disadvantage. I can tell you the number of games that I have won thanks to the quality of my troops. I can also tell you there have been many games where my very elite German forces have been completely and utterly swamped and overwhelmed by hordes of Russian conscripts. Very much cuts both ways. On top of all this, despite the many advantages that have been discussed about the Panzer IV, about the many things it brings to the table, unfortunately, strictly speaking, it's not very meta, and I hesitate to use that word in the context of bolt action, but it's not a very competitive unit. When it comes to armor in bolt action, light armor that can spam machine guns or cheap HE, really cheap HE, is actually the more common way to go. So weirdly, if you're looking at taking an effective German Panzer force, you don't want to be looking at the Panzer IV. You want to be looking at things like the Panzer I and the Panzer II, something that can just, like 70 points, just chuck down like 2 MMGs and just spray firepower everywhere. I mean, think about it. At the end of the day, if you're taking a Panzer IV, late war Panzer IV, and you're using it to fire 2 MMGs, you are spending more than 3 times the cost than if you just taken like a Panzer I and use its 2 machine guns. You're getting exactly the same result. You're getting exactly the same damage output for a third of the price. My understanding is that bolt action competitive play tends to be focused around elite veteran infantry supported by as many flamethrowers and high explosive units you can cram into your list. And strictly speaking, armor takes a back seat and tends to be relegated to those units that can spam machine guns as cheaply and effectively as possible. For example, In a German high-level list, you might find a Panzer 1 running around the place instead of taking a medium machine gun team. Think about it. Why would you spend 50 points on a medium machine gun team that can't move and shoot, is susceptible to being sniped, and overall is relatively fragile? For just 20 points more, you can take a Panzer 1. It gets double the amount of machine guns. It also can move and shoot at a relative minor penalty, and it's immune to snipers and small arms in general, making it significantly more durable. If it dies, you don't really mind. You've not lost a huge asset. But with all of that now said, let's get to the last section of the video, which is the score out of 10 and my final thoughts. I'm going to give the Panzer IV a solid 8.5 out of 10. I consider this to be a great jack-of-all-trades beginner tank that even veterans can enjoy and get some use out of. It's welcome in almost any German list, and the best thing about it is it's perfect for pickup games. If you don't know what you're going to be facing off against, or you have a general principle of not list tailoring, you can't go wrong with putting a Panzer IV in there. You will be able to engage enemy vehicles, enemy hordes, and everything in between, and just be comfortable in the knowledge that your Panzer IV will not let you down. The reason that I took 1.5 points off it is because of that price tag. I actually didn't take more than half a point off for it being technically not meta, because I tend to find that the most common games of bolt action are not the competitive ones, and in fact it's more of those fun casual pickup games that you play with your mates or down at the local club. But all of this is like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think of the Panzer IV down in the comment section below, and also let me know which unit you want me to review next week. If you enjoyed today's video, then make sure you smash that like button like you're smashing through the Ardennes, and also subscribe to never miss an episode. And if you found today's video particularly fun or informative, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon. By becoming a supporter, not only will you be helping the channel, but you will also gain access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 1,500 active members. It's really exploded in popularity over the last 6 months, and it's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got areas for discussing Warhammer 40k, bolt action, and many other game systems too. So if you want to become part of an online community and discuss this fantastic game, which is bolt action and many others, then please consider becoming a supporter and getting yourself in that Discord. And before we end the video, I just want to say a big thank you to all the latest channel members. So thank you to Looted Gamer, Mario, Alex Ribchester, Krivicus, Nix, Offensive Brainbug, TreeFireX, The Dash, Ben, and Nope Maybe. Thank you guys for doing your part. I also want to shout out the latest Patreons as well. So a massive thank you to Jeff Silverbloom, Sven Langbean, Captain Neverscared, and Deathcore Commander. And last, but certainly not least, I want to say a special heartfelt thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a massive thank you to Alan Blunt III, Bon Vert, Mark Panconi, Ridemaster 134-1, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Diesel Fox, and August Varney. Thank you guys. Your ongoing and generous support makes a huge difference, and I am eternally grateful to every single one of you. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.